I'll be presenting next. Now I have, for the first time na I've pre-recorded my presentation.
Before you present, Sarah, let me say something about you, if I may. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Sarah Lynne Salvador Daway-Ducanes, who is an associate professor at the University of the Philippines School of Economics, from which she also obtained her bachelor's in economics degree, summa cum laude, in 2003, and a master's economics degree in 2005. She earned her PhD economics from the University of California, Riverside in 2012. Until recently, she held the position of UP School of Economics Research Director and was an executive editor of the Journal of Asian Economics. She is currently a board member of the Philippine Economic Society. Her research interests include macroeconomic theory, monetary theory, and policy and related topics in development economics. Dr. Daway-Ducanes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Gisela, for that generous introduction. So as I said earlier, I've pre-recorded my presentation. Thank you. Good morning again to everyone. This is a short presentation on COVID-19 and the external threats posed by its effects on the Philippine economy. I focus on two external threats, namely the threat to remittances and to tourism. The outline of the presentation is as follows. We first look at the contribution of remittances and tourism to the Philippine economy. We then focus on remittances and tourism in 2019, and then lay out the outlook on these sectors for 2020. Using an input-output framework, we then present the simulated output and employment effects of decreased remittances and tourism due to COVID-19. And finally, we briefly discuss some policy implications. Tourism and remittances are both important to the Philippine economy, each making up a substantial portion of GDP. In 2019, tourism direct gross value added was at around 2.5 trillion pesos, making up about 12.7% of GDP. Inbound, or foreign tourism expenditures, were at 549 billion pesos. This is about 15% of total tourism expenditures in the country, while domestic tourism expenditures, that is, tourism expenditures made by residents, were at about 3.14 trillion pesos, which is about 85% of total tourism expenditures. The tourism sector employed around 5.71 million workers, making up about 13.5% of total employment in 2019. In the same year, remittances were at 1.70 trillion pesos, making up around 8.7% of GDP. Cash remittances, which are remittances coursed through banks and other formal financial institutions, were at 1.53 trillion pesos, or 7.8% of GDP. Now, in times past, remittances have been observed to act as buffers against economic downturns. Relatives residing and working abroad tend to remit money to relatives in need during difficult times, thereby promoting consumption stability amongst remittance-receiving households in the Philippines. In the couple of years leading to the pandemic, remittances have been purported to fund investments in real estate, housing, and spending on consumer durables. As mentioned earlier, cash remittances reached around $30 billion, equivalent to 1.53 trillion pesos. Now, cash remittances are remittances that are coursed through banks and other formal financial institutions, that is, remittance centers like LBC Pera Padala, pawn shops, etc. Land-based sources accounted for 78% of total remittances, whereas sea-based sources, primarily from incomes remitted by Filipino seafarers, accounted for 22% of cash remittances. In 2019, 42% of cash remittances, or 643 billion pesos, came from the Americas, around 90% of which came from the US, 22% from Asia, 20% from the Middle East, 13% from Europe, 3% from Oceania, and 0.01% from Africa. The pie chart here shows the expenditures of a remittance-receiving household. This is based on the 2015 Family Income and Expenditure Survey. Food and beverages had the largest share, at 29% of total expenditures, followed by housing, rent, and utilities, 25%, miscellaneous goods and services and other disbursements, 20%. Now notice that education made up only about 4.4%, while health made up only 3% of total expenditures. Transport expenditures made up an even larger share of 4.9%, while recreation, culture, accommodation, special family occasion was at 3.2% and higher than health expenditures. The pie chart here shows the profile of inbound tourism expenditures. Using 2018 expenditure shares, accommodation services for visitors had the largest share at around 25%. This is followed by food and beverage serving services at 24%, then by transport services at 23%, entertainment and recreation services 14%, shopping 11%, miscellaneous goods and services 2%, and the spending on travel agencies and other reservation services at 1%. We now discuss the outlook for remittances and tourism in 2020 in the face of the COVID-19 generated crisis. The table here shows the top 10 remittance sources in 2019. Together, these 10 countries were the source of 1.20 trillion pesos, or 78% of total cash remittances. 574 billion pesos, or 35%, came from the US, followed by 7% from Saudi Arabia, 6% each from Singapore and Japan, 5% each from the UAE and the UK, and 3% each from Canada, Hong Kong, Germany, and Kuwait. However, due to COVID-19, these countries are themselves facing dismal economic growth prospects. The Q1 year-on-year growth rate of US GDP was at -5%, -1% for Saudi Arabia, negative for the rest of the other top remittance sources. The IMF GDP growth outlook for 2020 for these countries is also dire, ranging from -1.1% to -7%. The US, our biggest remittance source, is expected to suffer a -5.9% decline in GDP growth for the entire year. Indeed, before the pandemic, in January and February 2020, remittances rose 6.6% and 2.5% year-on-year, respectively. In March, remittances were down by 4.7%. Rounding up the year-on-year Q1 growth of remittances to just about 1.5%, compared to the 4.1% Q1 growth of remittances in 2019. In April, remittances dropped further from $2.44 billion to $2.05 billion, a 16.2% year-on-year decline. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or the BSP, forecasts a 5% drop in remittances, equivalent to around 0.4% of GDP. Now, JICA, or the Japan International Cooperation Agency, forecasts quite a large drop, of around 33%, while the Department of Labor and Employment's forecast is not far behind at around 40%. Thus, remittances are expected to decline somewhere between 5 to 40%, which is quite a wide range. To make some sense of these estimates, let's do some back-of-the-envelope computations. In 2019, OFW remittances for 6 months, from April to September, were at 212 billion pesos. Now, assuming that OFW remittances for the entire year is just double this, that would give us about 424 billion pesos for the entire year. As of today, there are about 500,000 OFWs that have lost their jobs due to COVID-19. They make up about 23% of the 2.2 million OFWs estimated by the Philippine Statistics Authority. Thus, expected OFW remittance losses for 2020 are about 3/4 or 424 billion pesos times 23%, which gives us about 72 billion pesos, making up about 4.73% of 2019 remittances. However, these are only remittances from OFWs. Around 72% of remittances are transfers made by non-residents, mainly Filipinos who have become residents of the countries where they are now working at, to Filipino households. Given the World Bank's forecast of a global decline of around 5.2%, this brings the expected remittance losses from other sources by about 57 billion pesos, around 3.76% of 2019 remittances. So adding up 3.76% and 4.73% gives us around 8.5%. This is the expected decline in remittances, OFW remittances, and remittances from other sources in 2020. Alternatively, we can have the following computations. In quarter one, remittances grew by about 1.5%. Now, in April, remittances declined by 16.18%. Now, suppose that the May and June growth rates are the same as in April, so that's 16.8 to 18% decline, and 10% for the rest of the year. So doing the computations, so we arrive at negative 8.68% decline in remittances for 2020, or that's around 9% decline in remittances for the entire year. Now we go to the tourism outlook for 2020. Tourist arrivals all over the world dropped by as much as 57% in March, according to the UNWTO, or UN World Tourism Organization, now as many economies started imposing lockdown measures. International tourism is expected to decline all over the world for the entire year by about 58 to 78%. Now in the Philippines, international tourist arrivals already declined by 54% from January to April 2020, and tourism revenues decreased by 55% for the same period, according to DOT Secretary Puyat. The Philippine Tourism Survey reports that 80% of tourism operators expect losses of over 50% of 2020 revenues. Using a diagram, we now lay out the input-output framework which we used to come up with our simulation results. Due to COVID-19, global demand declines, which results in lower remittances and international tourism. The decline in remittances reduces aggregate consumption and investment, while the decline in international tourism reduces exports. In turn, the decline in aggregate demand reduces the final demand for the sectoral outputs, that is, outputs of agriculture, industry, and the services sectors. Decreased demand for the outputs of these sectors, in turn, reduce the demand for the intermediate inputs used in these sectors. Now, these result in a decline in aggregate supply, which reduces the demand for factors of production, namely land, labor, capital, which in turn has adverse effects on incomes and employment in these sectors, and the overall adverse implications for growth, poverty, and inequality. So we look at the following scenarios. For remittances, we look at the effects of a 5%, 9%, and 40% decline in cash remittances. Whereas for tourism, we look at a 58% and 78% decline in inbound tourism. This is in accordance with the forecasts made by the UNWTO. Now we look at the simulated output and employment effects of decreased remittances. A 5% decline in remittances results in a 76 billion peso decline in gross value added, equivalent to about 0.39% of GDP. This is the same as, or almost the same as, the BSP's forecast. And a potential employment decline of around 140,000 jobs, equivalent to 0.34% of 2019 total employment. Now, a 9% decline in remittances results in a 0.70% decline in GDP. That's about 137 billion pesos. And a 0.60% decline in total employment. This is around 603,000 jobs. A 40% decline in remittances would result in a 3.13% decline in GDP, equivalent to about 610 billion pesos, and a 2.68% decline in total employment, which is equivalent to about 1.12 million jobs. This table here shows the 10 most affected subsectors from decreased remittances. The total gross value added losses in these sectors account for about 0.30% to 2.38% of GDP. The most heavily affected sectors are wholesale and retail, which is the hardest hit by far. These are the malls, grocery stores, etc. Ownership of dwellings and real estate activities. Primarily condominiums, which according to anecdotes were funded heavily by OFW remittances. Electricity, education, accommodation and food service activities. These are mainly hotels, restaurants, resorts, land transport, food manufacturing, furniture and fixtures, and communication. Communication, we have mobile and internet usage. Moving on to the simulated output and employment effects of decreased inbound tourism, a 58% to 78% decline in inbound tourism results in a 318 to 428 billion peso decrease in gross value added, equivalent to 1.63 to 2.19% decline in GDP. The potential employment losses range from about 916,000 to 1.23 million jobs, equivalent to 2.20 to 2.96% of total employment. As in the case of decreased remittances, the services sector is and by far the most heavily affected sector. The gross value added losses of the 10 most heavily affected sectors range from about 1.19% to 1.60% of GDP. Again, the most heavily affected sector is wholesale and retail, but this is followed closely by accommodation and food service activities, then by arts, entertainment and recreation, food manufacturers, air transport, non-bank financial intermediation, electricity, other mining and quarrying, land transport, and petroleum and other fuel products. The potential employment losses in these 10 sectors range from about 670,000 to 900,000 jobs. So the range is about 1.61% to 2.17% of total employment. In both cases, in the case of decreased remittances and decreased tourism, 6 to 7 out of the 10 hardest hit subsectors belong to the services sector, while the rest are industry subsectors. Now on to some policy implications. Counter the decline in demand due to decreased remittances and tourism by boosting consumer and investor confidence by first proactively dealing with the public health sector crisis. One way of concretely doing this is by fast-tracking investments on telemedicine, which can help unburden our healthcare facilities. Another is to prioritize help to micro, medium, and small enterprises or MSMEs. In all simulations, wholesale and retail, accommodation and food service activities emerged in the top 10 most heavily affected sectors, while some subsectors are under manufacturing. Now, according to the PAASE's 2018 list of establishments, 46% of MSME establishments are under wholesale and retail, 14.5% in accommodation and food service activities, and 12% in manufacturing. These three alone employ about 3.61 million workers, equivalent to almost 9% of total employment. Help then can be in the form of loans and other liquidity support measures to address their cash flow problems, to preserve jobs, ensure business continuity, and build capacity for strengthening resilience to adverse shocks. Another policy implication involves preparing comprehensive, well-coordinated, and clearly communicated tourism recovery plans, beginning with domestic tourism. Recovery will have to start by encouraging domestic tourism with strictly implemented health protocols. And it has to start, with domestic tourism as one. This has the lion's share of tourism expenditures, around 85%. And number two, restoring inbound tourism confidence will also depend on how well domestic tourism is handled. Last is build resilience through increased digitization and production flexibility. Building resilience involves making investments not only on physical capital, for example, roads, bridges, machinery and equipment, etc., but also on human capital, that is education and health, and on improving technology, especially information and communication technology. The current pandemic has brought to light the importance of digitization, especially in facilitating contactless transactions and social distancing. Sectors and firms that are able to more flexibly transform their operations and leapfrog faster onto digital or online platforms stand to lose less and gain more quickly during and in the aftermath of the pandemic. In this further connection, public-private investments are key to fast-tracking improvements in digital technology and infrastructure, which would potentially generate gains that will outlast the effects of this current global pandemic. This ends my presentation. Thank you, and the floor is now open for your questions. Okay, thank you. Now we open the floor to your questions. Okay, so this is a question from Dr. Mangajas addressed to yours truly. Have you estimated the effect of the transport lockdown on the various sectors? So Not yet, sir, although we've come up with, well, I have the estimates like for the entire economy, that takes into account uh, the effects of the decline in final demand for the different subsectors. So that includes, for the transport sector, but then the simulation is for the entire economy. And I am just not at liberty yet to, to divulge it.
Your model does not include the linkage from transportation to all of those things. You see, it's as though you can proceed to those sectors without taking care of the transportation needs of the workers and of the people who are going to be making use of those sectors. To me, that's the most important.
Actually,
the input-output, most important link is to have the transportation so that the workers of those sectors can go to work, and then the people who are buying the products of those services can go there and also make use of them, because this is not going to be all virtual, virtual
actually,
work.
sir, in the when we did the simulation, so we made assumptions regarding the decline in expenditure for transport services, for land, for airport, according to the shares of transport expenditures that say OFW households or households with OFWs or tourists, spend on these sectors. So those are already implicitly included in the simulation.
More basic yet, Sarah, the ability of the workers to take transportation to go to work in those sectors, and the ability of the demanders to take transportation to go to make use of those particular sectors. Ordinary jeepneys, for example. I think the jeepney transport sector is completely, out of the model, as though people are thinking it's there, but that's the most important missing link in letting, in improving the economy.
I agree, sir. Although we've just focused, as I said, in the simulations, we just focused on the effects of decline in remittances on the spending patterns of households that are receiving these remittances, and also of those sectors, the decline in the demand for the sectors that are directly involved in the tourism sectors. So those also include, a certain extent, land, air, water transport services.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you.
I have a question for Maha. Maha, I thought I heard you that the intermittency problem of REs, I mean, these are the REs like solar and wind, not the hydro, is alleviated. Can you please explain that? Is there a new technology now that they would really have batteries or access to batteries so that they can become mainstay for our energy power?
The intermittency cost. So one solution to the intermittency cost is the battery storage, right?
Yes.
Although the development of the battery, the technological development of battery is not as fast as we all know relative to the development of solar panels. But that's not the only solution to intermittency. There are other solutions like that, diversification. Like in the US, we have the hydro to cover for the intermittency problem, and there's also the technology with regards to the projecting the demand in terms of the system being used in the wholesale electric in the systems operator. So that's also part of managing the intermittency. So all those combined, uses of managing the intermittency shows that it's already falling in the US. So the question now is, given that we are seeing those falling costs for intermittency and that the technology for battery storage is up and coming, why do we have slower investments in the Philippines for those REs?
Later.
Yes, Dr. Pernia.
Sports car.
You have a question? Yes, please, Dr. Pernia.
Yes, again, a couple of quick questions. Just to segue from Monching Clarete's question on Maha. You mentioned a conundrum. You said that despite the FIT being applied to renewables, there's still the investment in renewables is still very shy, or they're still staying away from renewables. Is it because the FIT is a signal that that the cost of renewables are going to be unstable or unpredictable, and that is what is keeping away investors in renewables? And then just a very quick question also to Sarah and Jeff. I'm sure you have seen the data comparing the expenditures or spending on COVID-19 related issues across ASEAN countries, and the Philippines is really badly lagging behind. For example, we are only spending as a percentage to GDP, we're only spending 5.7%, whereas Vietnam is spending 10% of GDP, Thailand 16%, Malaysia 22%, and Indonesia 6%. So I think it would be useful, and on per capita basis also very low. We're only spending $197 dollars per person, whereas Vietnam is spending $277 per person. In Thailand is $1,211 per person, and so on. Anyway, I think that the problem is we are not spending enough on COVID, with respect to the health aspect as well as to the economy, and therefore, perhaps by getting a ballpark figure in terms of how much it would cost, what you have recommended, what Jeff has recommended in terms of social safety net and additional spending on also employment insurance and so on. And then Sarah's recommendation, Dr. Sarah's recommendations on how to boost tourism, and especially tourism, and also the remittances. How much would that be in terms of additional spending by the government, so that at least we can, signal to the government that we should really spend more rather than less on this COVID related issues. Thank you. Maha, thank you for.
Yes, thank you, Sec Ernie, for the question. Actually, what we are saying is that FIT is actually very costly. It's a subsidy, and we are the ones paying it. So in the bill that we have, it's the FIT all allowance. So that's the one that we are paying. So it's very costly. And in another paper, we have simulated the cost, the welfare cost of FIT. What we're saying is that the cost of renewables, the technology, is already declining. So it's probably, I still don't have the study to back this up, but it's likely that the bureaucratic hurdles is the one that's impeding the investments of this renewable in the Philippines. In the beginning, most countries really did use FIT. But again, there's a lot of studies in the US that have already demonstrated the welfare cost of using these subsidies. And even in ASEAN, there's a recent paper, I think by Lantau Group, that's saying that Asian countries are now moving away from these subsidies. because the technology is really now, the cost of this technology is really now going down. The battery, the development of the technology for battery is also going down. So all these things about managing the cost of intermittency is also declining. So we should hopefully be seeing more of solar and wind into the grid. And recently, there's already news about solar generation being offered outside of FIT. So because it's becoming now competitive.
But isn't FIT supposed to be an incentive for investors to come in and invest in renewables?
Yes,
that's the
but it's,
idea. Yeah.
But it's a very costly subsidy. So rather than subsidizing, because it's now becoming cheaper now, the technology.
Costly to the government. It's costly to the government, but beneficial.
We're the one paying for
to the customer. Yeah.
Yeah, we're the one paying for the subsidy. In the
it's going to be it should attract investors. I thought that was the idea.
Yeah, it did, but there's a particular amount where they can be subscribed to. So now for solar, the subscription has already been filled, and advocates are advocating for a higher subscription. But there's also supplier who already offering generation that is outside FIT, meaning they can already compete. So it's becoming now cost competitive.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ma. So any ballpark figure estimate, Jeff, in terms of what would be the cost to the government if we do all those things that you have recommended, like employment insurance and additional subsidies, social safety nets, and all that?
Okay, sir. Thank you for the question. So I don't have any ballpark figure yet. We're in the process of computing them, but I'll just note that I agree with the sentiment you expressed earlier that we're probably under investing at the moment in terms of social protection. We are in extraordinary times. I think the old yardsticks as to what are acceptable in terms of deficit to GDP ratio or even debt to GDP ratio, I think we move away from them. Of course, we should not completely abandon prudence, but I don't think we should be afraid to incur a larger deficit or a larger debt if the goal is to actually help those who are in great distress. Because what is the government for if not to make sure that the most vulnerable are protected? So I don't have any ballpark figure yet, but for sure it is much more than what was allocated for in Bayanihan 1 in terms of the social protection component of it.
Yeah, it's rather ironic because we have, I think, among the best credit rating among ASEAN countries, and yet we're not taking advantage of that. We are rather protecting it rather than being afraid of spending more, so borrowing more, and therefore risking the downgrade. So that I think that is the thing now. That I think is not the correct direction or vision on the part of the government. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Sec Manager, for those questions. Well, as Jack said, we still don't have an overall estimate right now. But the official estimates for the decline in GDP for the entire year is now between -3% to -4%. And we've only, I think, spent or only about 200 billion pesos were disbursed of the 390 from the Bayanihan 1 Act. No, so that's definitely very, very small. If we're going to plug in the whole, 3 to 4% would need about 800 billion to about 1 trillion pesos, depending on the fiscal multiplier. Now, the fiscal multiplier, well, we don't have an exact estimate, but my sense is that during during recessions, the fiscal multiplier tends to be lower, even as people hold off their spending decisions, both to consumers and investors. So definitely, you're right. What's been allocated so far is, think not enough, even 1.3 trillion, because that might just plug in like a hole of about -5%, -6% growth. But with what's happening right now, my sense is that the GDP growth prospects for the entire year might even be more dire.
Thank you, Professor Sarah.
Could I just comment on this COVID? And it's more about, I think, if COVID is teaching us something, it's really shifting from in-person to online, all this physical distribution to logistics to using online commerce. So the most important part with investment that we really have to consider is making that internet infrastructure really fast, because that is, I think, holding us down in taking advantage of new ways of distributing goods. And even our traditional farming, I mean, you can develop a supply chain that is basically dependent on our using information technology, ICT. But then if they don't have access there in the farm, in the rural areas for internet, that will really delay us. So I think if we are thinking about making more investments for recovering from COVID, or leaping into newer, better future, I think the government should really make our internet infrastructure a lot better.
Agree. That's right.
We agree. And is Dr. Balisacan still here? Because I think that has implications for probably for bringing in a third telco even more to spur competition in the industry.
Second the motion, Mon.
Sorry, Sarah, are you asking me a question, or sorry?
Yes, because Sir Munching was talking about revamping up our internet facilities, internet connection, and I think that's pretty much connected, very well connected to the issue of having a third or even more telcos.
That's correct.
Hello, sir. I think we lost Dr. Balisacan. Hello, sir.
I think this proves the point, ma'am. Naghang po si sir.
Sayang. Okay, we'll go back to Dr. Balisacan once just case in point, no? Like, how important good internet connections are, and if they go bust, then yeah, meetings such as this are. Do we have any more questions from the floor?
Ma'am, just a last question po.
Yes, Sarah,
Yes.
I just wanted to ask you this question. I noted in your slide on OFWs that, and you highlighted it, a very small percentage that's invested, their remittances to education. And yet we know that we have to think of the long-term benefits of these remittances on our GDP and on the economy. So are there measures you could think of to divert or to increase the investment, I mean, in a strategic or targeted way of these remitters to the education of their families and their communities? Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. I think Jeff would be in a better position to answer that.
Okay, sorry, I only heard the question very vaguely. So it's about the how to ensure that, or how to try to make remittances be more beneficial in terms of being used more for education. Well, actually, although if you actually look at the household data, what you find when you examine it is that households with OFWs controlling for income and other household characteristics, they actually spend more on education than non-OFW households. So even if they have the same income, so they are more likely, for example, to send their children to college, to a private college at that, compared to a similar non-OFW household. But as a percent of total spending, I guess it is still small. That's partly because for many OFWs and a big portion of the OFW households are in the top income groups, like 60% of them belong to the top 40% of households. A lot of them, the bank or their money is invested in real estate. So if their money is invested in a bank, for example, or saved in a bank, even though they themselves are not investing, they are making the money available for investors to borrow. So I think, in fact, that one of the reasons why interest rates have been quite low for a time, one factor that has contributed to that is this large inflow of remittances that go into the banking system. I think we have to sort of also move away from the old model where you expect the OFWs to themselves be the entrepreneurs. Some of them can do that, but some of them cannot do that. For those who cannot do that, maybe it's enough that they save money, make sure that they earn enough in terms of return on investment, but they don't have to make the investment themselves, but make sure that the money is available for others to use in investment.
Yeah, so follow-up comment from me. So looks like if they invest in the bank, right, those investments could support MSMEs, right? But the other major, we call funnel for all those remittances earned would be the condos, the real estate. And that, again, is something that does not have the inclusivity of, the effect of inclusive growth and development. And so the savings, the remittances of the OFWs, they're just caught into the, coffers of the top wealthiest in the country. So this has always been our concern, that there might be a way for the government to influence by incentives the way our OFWs invest their money.
Okay, so I agree, ma'am, that it's probably true that too much of the remittances go to the purchase of condominium units, for example. So you have a lot of condominium units that are actually not occupied, whether you're looking at condominiums in Metro Manila or Tagaytay, for example. And in fact, that's the one reason why we expect the construction and real estate to probably go down some more this year and probably next because of the decline in remittances. I think addressing that, I think the problem is the environment for entrepreneurship, the environment for investment. I think that's the one that government has to address. Maybe other people will have something to say on this also, like Dr. Bolongaita, for example. So people put their money into condominiums because it's difficult for them to find an alternative that is guaranteed to generate a good return, while at the same time putting not too much risk on them. And addressing that problem requires generating or establishing a good environment for entrepreneurship, which means that you must have a strong rule of law in place. The time it takes for people to establish a business should be relatively quick, and so on.
Yeah, it's what we wish it was a virtuous cycle, Sec Ernie, but it's a vicious cycle. And it boils down to, well, the need for more S&T education that would create a more or higher value among our MSMEs, and well, make our GDP growth more inclusive. If I think I get it right, because a lot of the GDP is reflective of you know, what's growth and development of still the wealthy sector of our population. So I think that there might be ways to support STI ecosystems that would then be established in the regions of the country. And I really think that OFWs might have an important role in supporting and sustaining this. In another session of this conference, we had a model of a very successful farm, Costales Farm in Laguna, that is supported by OFWs. So that's one way of doing it. But the other way is, as I've always suggested, to try to incentivize X% of our OFWs to come home to their regions and establish MSEs, even if you say that they're not entrepreneurs, but they've learned how to do things properly in the medical sector, the health sector, the hotel or tourism sector, and other business sectors in the advanced countries where they're working. So, you know, if we had this kind of competent and skilled human capital back in their regions, there might be a way to jumpstart or to seed these higher value MSMEs in these regions.
There's a question on the chat board. This is addressed to Jeff. How can we increase private or venture capital investment in technology and R&D? Does this involve matching funds from government?
Sorry, I had the problem unmuting myself. I think especially now, Dr. Serafika, I think especially now that will be an important aspect of increasing private capital investment. Because of course now, the animal spirits or the enthusiasm of people for consumption is very low. At the same time, the importance of investment in technology has never been more important. I think now there's a great pressure for countries, for example, to try to accelerate their moves towards Industry 4.0. But how will they do that if there is no clear returns? There are no clear returns in the near future. So I think there's an important role for government to support such investments by, for example, providing matching funds to reduce the risks for those who would want to invest in technology that will actually be productive for the country over the longer term.
Just to add to that, Jeff, I think the question brings to mind the example in Israel, no? Where, as you know, it is probably one of the most successful countries with respect to commercialization, and the startup culture there is something that has been embraced by Silicon Valley itself. No? So there, in terms of the density of startups in Israel, since they have the explanation for that, so to speak, has been in great part due to the role of government, but in its involvement in partnership with private capital. However, one of the interesting things about that is that in Israel, government investments, they've been willing to take a loss, no? and even not entering the space without really seeking to generate a profit, no? In the sense that they even were willing to take a backseat to the private investors. So to letting the private sector really be even more incentivized. So I think that explains in part, how government was able to attract, private capital. The role of the university sector, of course, as Professor Concepcion mentioned, referred to, cannot be, I think, understated. And again, you will see that in Israel's experience, and of course in the U.S. as well. There are important, elements for incentivizing, faculty and students to be entrepreneurial. And it doesn't mean that if a country is wealthy, they can have a very successful commercialization culture in universities. Australia invests a lot in research, but is at the last of the OECD rankings. We are not very good at commercializing, publicly funded research, unlike compared to in the U.S., for example. And part of this is the fact that in Australia the government's investment in research, they seek to get a big cut from inventors' products. So you've got for example, in Australia the federal government will take a third, the state a third, and then a third will go to the inventor, for commercially funded research. In Carnegie Mellon and other universities, it's the 5% rule. Universities only take 5%, and inventor is king. So there is, again, those are the, some of the small details that I think can make a big difference to spurring innovation and commercialization.
Thank you, Dr. Balongaita. Dr. Balisacan, sir, you were cut off earlier. You were saying something about the importance of having more competition amongst our telcos.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry, I got disconnected. That only tells you how good our internet facility is. But yeah, I was saying that there's really a major challenge for the country to roll out quickly this internet connectivity infrastructure, and the problems is really quite extensive, involving from local governments all the way to national governments, including regulators. And yet, as we address the COVID-19 challenges and the recovery issues, there are also calls to actually even weekend regulators that are supposedly like the competition authority, for example, to supposedly strengthen the capacity of the economy to make markets even work more effectively, even during and especially even during times like this, because the possibilities for mergers that could turn out to be anti-competitive are quite high during this time. And given an economy like us that is, so to begin with, already highly concentrated, these opportunities for mergers and acquisitions, which are likely to be too many, are likely going to even exacerbate that problem. So I think it's it's a leadership concern that we need to embrace, that these challenges be addressed. But let me also quickly address that or comment on the investment issue earlier, especially in relation to the OCW. I think that there, Dr. Concepcion was noting the need to provide better information, information sets to OCWs as to where they could place their money, so that it could help them directly, but also it could help the economy moving forward. I think that I am usually quite allergic to the idea that OCWs, households themselves, do not know where to put their money best. I think that what we should embrace and what we know in our understanding of household dynamics is that they're so much constrained by the information set. So they behave on the basis of the information that they have. I think Dr. Blongayatay earlier mentioned about information asymmetry. And I think that's what the problem facing our OCWs and many households. They don't have the much information about what opportunities are available. Also that there's this big issue about the investment climate that mentioned by Jeff. I think the big challenge really here is in this country is the improvement in the investment climate. Let me note that when we were doing that Ambition Nut in 2040, it struck us to find when we do a nationwide survey of households that one of the single most ambitions or aspirations of Filipinos is to have a decent home and a home that's detached. And given that, and you frame that in the context of the backlogs in housing, I think that the observation that you see that OCWs, and they have the money, they use that for real estate. That's essentially what it is. That's what they want to see an improvement in their welfare, that dimension of welfare in the housing. And given the backlogs, as I said, even that, even if they put their money in real estate, that is going to have a major impact, tremendous impact for many years on the economy. Because and you can use this real estate construction industry as a whole as one of the pillars of economic growth for many years. And so I am not too worried about investors or OCW's resources going into real estate because of the nature of of the backlogs and the aspirations of Filipinos. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Balisacan, for that. Now, we're well over the time allotted to us. So we'd like to thank again our speakers for such very interesting and informative presentations, and also to all the participants, all those who've asked their questions. Thank you for spending time with us. Ma'am Gisela, would you like to give the final words?
Yes, I'm very grateful to our speakers, our distinguished speakers, and to our distinguished participants for staying on with us. And this is supposed to be only for 2 hours, but we're now on 3.5 hours. And it's understandable because this is probably one of the most important sessions in PAASE 40th anniversary symposium. And it concerns our national welfare. So thank you very much to all. And I'm hoping that some of you will keep on following PAASE's activities. So we have an active website. Actually, for those who are members in the audience, we have a campaign to get a Start Fresh lifetime membership fee paid, okay? Because we want to raise some funds for PAASE. We're private, non-government. We also welcome donations to our organization, and we have actually identified about 10, 11 categories of projects that we would like to support. And this would include helping our postgraduate students earn their PhDs abroad. Of course, it's lopsided in terms in favor of the United States because this is the Philippine-American Academy of Science and Engineering with its origins in 1980 in the United States. But we're also going to support the writing of policy papers and training of, say, researchers in state universities and colleges, in leading universities in Metro Manila, and likewise the training of our postgraduate students in universities in the United States and elsewhere. So we're trying to create this STI ecosystem that we feel should be regionalized. Okay? So we'd like to showcase some regions that might show how science and technology is improving their lives. So thank you very much, everyone, for your focused attention. In particular, I'd like to thank our former NEDA secretaries who graced this occasion, Secretary Ernie Pernia and Secretary R.C. Balisacan. Also, our academician, Nas Mahar Mangahas. And of course, well, our special guest speaker, now our member in the PAASE, Dr. Emil Bolongaita, and everyone else. Former Dean Ramon Clarete, Dr. Jeff Ducanes, Dr. Mahalia Ravaga, and Dr. Sarah Daway-Ducanes. Thank you. Good day, good night, good afternoon to all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.